Sometimes life pushes you so far down that $100 feels like your last shot at hope. Frank DeLuca knew that feeling well. At 61 years old, widowed and out of work, he stood at a county auction with $100 in his pocket and watched people walk away from a property nobody wanted. It was listed as an old storage garage. Frank raised his hand and bought it. 3 days later, he cut the rusted lock and pulled open the door. Inside that dusty garage sat rows of beautiful vintage cars, untouched for decades, worth a fortune. But among those cars, Frank found something else. Something hidden? Something that pointed to a mystery the previous owner had kept secret for years. What was the millionaire trying to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank DeLuca's hands trembled slightly as he set down his coffee mug on the kitchen table. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of his rental house, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily through the air. This small house on Maple Street had been his home for the past 18 months, ever since he could no longer afford the mortgage on the place where he'd raised his children. That house, the one with the big backyard and the tire swing, had been sold to pay Margaret's medical bills. Margaret. 2 years gone now, and some mornings he still reached for her side of the bed, expecting to find her there. 38 years of marriage doesn't just fade away. The cancer had taken her slowly, giving them time to say goodbye, but also time to watch her suffer. The treatments had drained their savings, then their retirement, and finally forced them to sell everything of value. In the end, it hadn't been enough to save her. He looked at the bills spread across the table, 3 months behind on rent. The landlord, Mr. Kowalski, had been patient, but that patience was wearing thin. Frank had received another notice yesterday, this one with firmer language about eviction proceedings. At 61 years old, the prospect of homelessness felt terrifyingly real. The textile mill where Frank had worked for 35 years had closed 4 years ago. They'd said it was economics, global competition, the changing market. What it meant for Frank was that his skills, his decades of experience, suddenly meant nothing. He'd found odd jobs here and there, fixing fences, cleaning gutters, painting houses, but the work was irregular, and the pay barely covered groceries, let alone rent. His daughter Annie lived 3 states away with her husband and 2 children. She called on birthdays and holidays, brief conversations filled with polite questions and vague promises to visit soon. Frank understood. She had her own life, her own struggles. He didn't want to be a burden. He'd stopped mentioning his financial troubles months ago, tired of hearing the worry in her voice without any real help materializing. His son Tommy was a different kind of absence. 29 years old and still fighting demons that Frank didn't fully understand. Addiction had its claws deep in Tommy. There had been rehab programs, relapses, angry phone calls in the middle of the night, then long stretches of silence. Frank hadn't heard from Tommy in 4 months. He told himself that no news was good news, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. The isolation was the hardest part. Margaret had been his partner in everything, his companion, his best friend. Without her, the house felt cavernous despite its small size. Conversations with himself had become normal. Sometimes he'd narrate his actions just to hear a human voice. "Time to make lunch, Frank. Let's see what we've got." It was pathetic, and he knew it. His one true friend was Walt Grimes, a retired postal worker who lived 2 streets over. Walt was 68, a widower himself, and understood the particular loneliness of losing a spouse. They met most afternoons at Rosie's Diner on Main Street, where they'd nurse cups of coffee and play chess on Walt's battered travel set. Walt usually won, but Frank didn't mind. The company mattered more than the game. It was Walt who had brought the auction flyer to the diner 3 days ago, sliding it across the table between chess moves. "Might be something here for you," Walt had said, tapping a weathered finger on the paper. "Counties auctioning off abandoned properties. Tools, equipment, who knows? Could find something to resell." Frank had studied the flyer with skepticism. Most of the lots were parcels of land, foreclosed homes, nothing he could afford or use. But one listing caught his eye. Lot 47, described simply as detached storage facility, contents unknown, sold as is. The starting bid was $100. "That's all I've got left, Walt," Frank had admitted, embarrassed by the confession. Walt had leaned back, studying him with those sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. "Sometimes a man's got to take a chance. What else are you going to do with that $100? It'll be gone in a week anyway on food and gas. At least this way. Maybe you find something valuable. Maybe you don't. But you tried." Frank had folded the flyer and tucked it into his shirt pocket. The auction was scheduled for the following Saturday at the county courthouse steps. He'd gone home that evening and stared at the flyer for hours, weighing the risk. $100 was a week and a half of groceries. It was 2 tanks of gas. It was the difference between lights on and lights off. But Walt was right. The money would disappear regardless, spent on necessities that left no trace, no possibility of change. At least an auction lot offered a chance, however slim, of finding something to sell. Tools in good condition could bring a few $100s. Even scrap metal had value. Saturday had arrived with heavy grey clouds that threatened rain. Frank had dressed in his best remaining clothes, khaki pants with a worn spot on one knee, a button-down shirt that Margaret had bought him 5 Christmases ago, and a jacket that no longer quite fit across his shoulders. He'd lost weight over the past year. Not from any intentional diet, but from the simple economics of making food stretch. The courthouse steps had been crowded with people. Professional buyers with clipboards and calculating expressions. Couples looking for investment properties. A few curious locals just there for the spectacle. Frank had stood at the back, his $100 folded carefully in his wallet, feeling out of place among people who seemed to know what they were doing. The auctioneer had worked through the lots methodically. Properties sold for thousands, tens of thousands. Frank had watched, half hypnotized by the rapid-fire calling of bids, the decisive strikes of the gavel. Then they'd reached Lot 47. Detached storage facility located at 1847 Old Mill Road, the auctioneer had announced. Contents unknown, structure sold as is, no warranties or representations. Starting bid $100. Silence. People had shuffled, checked their papers, but no hands went up. The property was too far out of town, the description too vague. Nobody wanted to gamble on unknown contents in a building that might be falling apart. $100, the auctioneer repeated. Do I have 100? Frank's hand had risen almost of its own accord. His heart had pounded as every eye turned toward him. We have 100. Do I hear 150? More silence. The auctioneer had scanned the crowd, giving ample opportunity for another bid. None came. Going once at $100, going twice. The gavel came down. Sold to bidder 47 for $100. Just like that, Frank owned something. A structure he'd never seen, containing who knew what, located somewhere he'd have to find on a map. The auction clerk had processed his payment, taken his information, and handed him a receipt and a key. A small, ordinary key that looked like it might fit a padlock. You have 7 days to claim the property and remove any contents, the clerk had said in a bored tone. After that, it reverts to county control. Frank had driven home in a daze, the receipt and key sitting on the passenger seat like artifacts from someone else's life. Back in his small kitchen, he'd spread out a county map and located Old Mill Road. It was nearly 40 minutes outside of town, in an area he vaguely remembered as old industrial land that had been abandoned decades ago. The mill itself had closed long before Frank had even moved to the area. That evening, sitting alone with a simple dinner of canned soup and crackers, Frank had allowed himself to imagine what might be inside that storage facility. Tools seemed most likely. Maybe lawn equipment, construction supplies, forgotten inventory from some failed business. In his most optimistic moments, he pictured finding something genuinely valuable. Antique furniture, perhaps, or collectibles someone had stashed away and forgotten. But doubt crept in as darkness fell. What if the building was empty? What if it contained nothing but trash and debris? He'd just spent his last $100 on what might amount to a pile of garbage he'd have to pay to have hauled away. The thought kept him awake, long into the night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around him. Sunday had passed in anxious waiting. Monday brought another handyman job, replacing rotted boards on Mrs. Chen's back porch. The work paid $60 cash, which Frank immediately set aside for gas and any expenses related to his auction purchase. Tuesday, he'd helped Walt reorganize his garage, refusing payment but accepting a sandwich and the company. Wednesday morning, Frank could wait no longer. He'd borrowed Walt's pickup truck, a beat-up Ford that had seen better days but still ran reliably. Walt had agreed without hesitation, pressing the keys into Frank's hand, along with a thermos of coffee and a knowing look. "Call me when you get there," Walt had said. "Let me know what you find." The drive out Old Mill Road took Frank through increasingly rural landscape. Neat suburban homes gave way to scattered farmhouses, then to empty fields and stretches of forest. The road itself deteriorated from smooth asphalt to patched pavement to gravel. Frank's anxiety grew with each mile. This was truly the middle of nowhere. The GPS on his phone, a device he still didn't fully trust, directed him down a side road, barely wide enough for one vehicle. Trees pressed close on either side, branches scraping against Walt's truck. Frank winced at every sound, hoping he wasn't damaging his friend's vehicle. Then the trees opened up, and Frank found himself in a clearing dominated by a large metal structure. The building was bigger than he'd expected, perhaps 60 feet long and 30 feet wide, with walls of corrugated steel that had weathered to a mottled grey-brown. The roof showed patches of rust, but appeared intact. Weeds grew thick around the foundation, and young saplings had taken root near one corner, but overall the structure looked surprisingly solid. Frank parked the truck and sat for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, gathering his courage. This was it. The moment of truth. He grabbed his toolbox from the passenger seat. He'd brought bolt cutters, a flashlight, work gloves, and a crowbar, prepared for various possibilities. The front of the building featured a large rolling door, the kind used on commercial garages, secured with a heavy padlock that matched the key he'd been given. Frank approached slowly, his boots crunching on gravel and dead leaves. Up close, he could see that while the exterior showed its age, the construction was professional, substantial. This wasn't some thrown-together shed. Someone had built this to last. His hand shook as he inserted the key into the padlock. It turned smoothly, well-oiled despite years of apparent neglect. The lock opened with a solid click. Frank removed it, set it aside, and grasped the handle on the rolling door. He paused, offering a silent prayer to Margaret, to God, to anyone who might be listening. Then he pulled. The door resisted at first, complaining with metallic groans, but then began to rise. Darkness yawned beyond, and the smell hit Frank immediately. Motor oil, old leather, dust, and something else, something almost sweet. Not decay, but age, like opening a trunk full of old clothes. Frank pulled the door higher, flooding the interior with morning sunlight. His breath caught in his throat. Shapes emerged from the darkness. Large shapes, covered with canvas tarps, arranged in neat rows. Frank stepped inside, his eyes adjusting, and pulled the flashlight from his toolbox. The beam swept across the space, revealing a concrete floor, clean despite the dust. Metal shelving along one wall held various containers and boxes, and everywhere those covered shapes. Frank approached the nearest one, a form roughly 15 feet long and 6 feet wide. His heart hammered as he grasped the edge of the canvas tarp. It was thick, heavy-duty material, secured with bungee cords. He unhooked the cords one by one, then pulled the tarp away. Underneath sat a car. Not just any car, but a 1967 Shelby GT500, its deep blue paint gleaming even under the layer of dust, chrome catching the light from the open door. Frank stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. He knew enough about cars to recognize this was something special, something valuable. With trembling hands, he moved to the next covered shape and pulled away its tarp. A red 1963 Corvette Stingray, its split rear window unmistakable. The next tarp revealed a 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda in bright orange. Then a 1969 Dodge Charger in black. Frank stumbled backward, his mind reeling. He counted the covered shapes. 20. 20 vehicles, all hidden under tarps, all apparently in pristine condition. This wasn't possible. This didn't make sense. How could someone just leave these here? How could they have been forgotten? He moved deeper into the building, his flashlight beam dancing across more covered cars, across the shelving units, across a workbench at the far end. On the workbench sat a metal filing cabinet, grey and utilitarian. Frank opened it with shaking hands. Inside were files, dozens of them, each labelled with a year and a car model. He pulled one at random, 1967 Shelby GT500. Inside the folder was the title, made out to Clarence Whitmore, along with maintenance records, purchase documentation, showing Clarence had bought the car in 1968 for $8,000, and handwritten notes about its condition and specifications. Frank pulled another folder. Another title in Clarence's name. And another. All the titles were here, organized, legal, transferable. The cars weren't just abandoned. They'd been carefully preserved, documented, waiting. Clarence Whitmore. The name was familiar, tickling at the edges of Frank's memory. A reclusive millionaire who'd lived on the outskirts of town, rarely seen in public. Frank remembered hearing about his disappearance years ago. 10 years? 15? The man had simply vanished one day, and eventually his estate had been liquidated, his properties sold off piecemeal. But somehow, this building, this collection, had been missed, or maybe hidden deliberately. Frank thought about the vague listing at the auction, the lack of details. Someone in the county office had listed this without really knowing what was here, and it had slipped through the cracks. Frank's legs gave out, and he sat heavily on the concrete floor, his back against the Shelby. Around him sat millions of dollars in vintage automobiles. In his pocket, he had a receipt showing he'd bought all of this for $100. He pulled out his phone and called Walt with shaking fingers. "Walt!" Frank's voice cracked as his friend answered. "Walt, you need to come out here." "Frank, what's wrong? You sound strange." "I'm fine. He looked around at the rows of covered cars, still barely believing what he was seeing. "I can't explain over the phone. Can you come? Please?" There was a pause. Walt knew Frank well enough to recognize genuine urgency. "Give me the address. I'll be there in 45 minutes. Frank stood on unsteady legs and walked back outside into the sunlight. The normal world seemed surreal now, knowing what waited inside that building. He paced in the clearing, checking his phone every few minutes, unable to settle. His mind churned with questions. What was he supposed to do with all this? Who could he tell? Who could he trust? Margaret's wedding ring hung on a chain around his neck, tucked under his shirt. He pulled it out now, holding it, seeking comfort from the familiar weight. "I don't know what to do," he whispered to her memory. "Help me figure this out." Walt's truck appeared down the narrow road exactly 43 minutes later, pulling into the clearing in a cloud of dust. The older man climbed out, his weathered face creased with concern. "Frank, what's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Come inside," Frank said simply. "Just come look." He led Walt to the open garage door. Walt stopped at the threshold, squinting into the dimness. Frank walked to the first car, the Shelby, and gestured at it. "This is what I found." Walt stepped closer, his eyes widening as he took in the pristine vehicle. Is that real?" "It's real, and there are 19 more." Frank swept his arm around the space. Walt walked slowly through the building, pulling back tarps, examining cars with increasing amazement. When he reached the filing cabinet and saw the titles, he let out a low whistle. "Frank, do you understand what you have here?" "I'm starting to. These cars, some of these are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. That Hemi Cuda alone could be $500,000. Walt turned to face him, his expression serious. "This changes everything for you." Frank nodded slowly, the weight of it settling over him. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up, that this can't be real." "It's real." Walt pulled out his phone. "I'm calling my nephew. He works at an auction house that specializes in vintage cars. He'll know what we're dealing with." "Walt, wait." Frank grabbed his friend's arm. "Something feels off about this. Why would Clarence Whitmore just leave all this here? Why wasn't it found when his estate was settled?" Walt lowered his phone, considering. "That's a good question. The man disappeared, 15 years ago. His properties were sold off. Someone should have found this." "Unless he hid it deliberately," Frank said. "Unless he didn't want it found." They stood in silence, both contemplating the implications. Finally, Walt spoke. "Let's look around more carefully. See if there's anything that explains this." They spent the next hour examining the building systematically. The cars were remarkable, but the real story seemed to be in the filing cabinet. Along with the titles and maintenance records, they found what appeared to be a journal, a thick, leather-bound book with Clarence Whitmore's name embossed on the cover. Frank opened it carefully. The first entry was dated 1965, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Today I purchased my first vehicle for the collection, a 1963 Corvette Stingray. I saw it at an estate sale and knew immediately it was special, not just for its mechanical perfection, but for what it represents: craftsmanship, beauty, an era when things were built to last." Frank flipped through pages, reading random entries. Clarence had documented each purchase, each car's history, but interwoven with the factual information were personal reflections. The man had been lonely. That much was clear. His wife, Margaret, had died in 1995. Frank's heart clenched at the shared name and loss. After her death, Clarence's entries became more philosophical, more melancholy. "These machines will outlast us all," one entry read. "What we leave behind matters more than what we accumulate. I've spent my life building wealth, but wealth is just numbers on paper. These cars are real. They're tangible. They're my legacy. Further into the journal, the tone shifted. Entries from the early 2000s showed increasing paranoia. Someone has been watching the house, a black sedan, parked down the street for hours. When I walk outside, it drives away. And later, I know what they want. They think I've forgotten, that time has erased the truth. But I haven't forgotten. I never will. Frank looked at Walt. He was afraid of something. Or someone, Walt added, reading over Frank's shoulder. The final entry in the journal was dated October 15th, 2010, 2 weeks before Clarence had disappeared. Final preparations complete. The truth is here for those who seek it. I've hidden what matters most, where only someone worthy will find it. Someone who needs hope as much as I needed redemption. If you're reading this, stranger, know that these cars are my gift to you. But they come with a responsibility. Don't let the truth die with me. Frank closed the journal, disturbed. What truth? What was he hiding? Walt walked back to the filing cabinet, opening drawers methodically. There has to be more. He said the truth is here. At the bottom of the cabinet, behind hanging folders, Walt found a small metal box. It wasn't locked, just latched. Inside were old photographs, dozens of them, showing Clarence as a younger man, perhaps in his 40s or 50s. Most featured him with another man, well-dressed and confident. They were pictured at construction sites, in front of office buildings, shaking hands at what appeared to be formal events. Frank turned one photograph over. Written on the back in faded ink, Clarence and Gregory Harding, groundbreaking ceremony, Riverwalk Project, 1978. Harding, Walt said quietly. That's a prominent name around here. The Harding family has been in real estate and development for generations. Frank found more photos, all documenting what appeared to be a business partnership between Clarence and this Gregory Harding. The dates ranged from 1978 to 1982. Then, abruptly, the photos stopped. Tucked among the photographs were newspaper clippings, yellowed with age. The first headline read, "Local Development Partners Announce Riverwalk Project, $50 million investment." The article described an ambitious plan to develop waterfront property, creating a mixed-use complex with residential, retail, and recreational space. Clarence Whitmore and Gregory Harding were named as the primary developers. But another clipping, dated 6 months later, told a different story. Riverwalk project abandoned. Investors withdraw amid questions. Frank read the article carefully. The project had collapsed amid vague references to financial irregularities and environmental concerns. Investors had pulled out suddenly, leaving Clarence and Gregory's partnership in ruins. No specific allegations were made, but the tone suggested something improper had occurred. Beneath the clippings, Frank found handwritten notes on legal pad paper, clearly in Clarence's hand. The writing was rushed, agitated, unlike the careful script in the journal. Gregory lied to me. The environmental surveys were falsified. He knew the land was contaminated from the old industrial site. Heavy metals, chemical runoff. The reports documented everything. But he buried the real findings and substituted clean reports. He showed me the fake ones and I believed him. I signed off on everything. Frank's stomach tightened as he continued reading. When I discovered the truth, I confronted him. He admitted it all without shame, said the contamination could be managed quietly, that no one needed to know. The investors had already committed their money. If we revealed the truth, we'd lose everything. He asked me to stay silent. When I refused, he turned cold, said I was in too deep, that I'd signed the fraudulent documents too. If he went down, I'd go down with him. He was right. I was complicit, even if I hadn't known. Walt let out a low breath. So Clarence discovered his partner had committed fraud and was being blackmailed into silence. It gets worse. Frank found another page, this one a photocopy of what appeared to be an official environmental report. The header read, "Riverside Property Environmental Assessment, Confidential." The document detailed extensive contamination, lead, arsenic, industrial solvents, at levels requiring significant remediation. At the bottom, a handwritten note from someone named A.C. stated, "Per our agreement, this report will not be filed with the Planning Commission." Substitute report attached. "They buried it," Frank said, feeling sick. "They knew the land was poison and they hid it." Walt was examining another photograph, this one different from the rest. It appeared to have been taken surreptitiously, showing Gregory Harding meeting with two men in suits in what looked like a parking garage. They were exchanging manila folders. Written on the back, "Evidence of the payoff. Planning Commission members. November 1981. He was bribing officials, Walt said, making sure the fake environmental reports were accepted. Frank sat down heavily on the workbench, his mind reeling. What had started as an incredible stroke of luck, finding these valuable cars, was becoming something far more complicated. Clarence hadn't just been a lonely collector. He'd been a man carrying the weight of terrible secrets. "What happened to the land?" Frank asked. "The Riverwalk project was abandoned. But what happened to the actual property?" Walt pulled out his phone, typing quickly. After a moment, his face went pale. "Frank, you need to see this." He held out the phone. The screen showed a real estate record. The riverside property in question had been sold by the development partnership at a significant loss to the county in 1983. According to public records, it had sat unused for years before being developed in 2005. The current use of the property was listed as Riverside Elementary School. Frank felt the blood drain from his face. "Children. There are children on that land. 550 students," Walt read from the school's website, "ages 5 through 11. They stared at each other, the magnitude of the discovery settling over them. This wasn't just about old business crimes. If the contamination was real and had never been remediated, those children could be in danger right now. "We need to call someone," Frank said. "The EPA, the health department." "With what proof?" Walt interrupted gently. 40-year-old documents and the private notes of a man who's been missing for 15 years. They'll ask questions. They'll investigate. But that takes time. Those kids don't have time if they're being exposed to lead and arsenic every day. Walt nodded. "I know. But we need to be smart about this. We need to understand the full picture before we start making accusations." Frank wanted to argue, but he knew Walt was right. He looked around the garage at the pristine cars, the carefully maintained collection. "Clarence kept all this for a reason. He said the truth is here. Maybe there's more we haven't found yet." They returned to the filing cabinet, searching more systematically. Behind the drawer containing the photographs, Frank found something unexpected. A locked drawer he'd initially missed. It was secured with a small combination lock. "The journal," Frank said suddenly. "Those numbers he circled. What if they're the combination?" They hurried back to the leather journal, flipping through pages. Throughout the entries, seemingly random numbers were circled or underlined, sometimes in the margins, sometimes in the middle of text. Frank wrote them down in the order they appeared. 1537-22. Back at the locked drawer, he tried the combination. The lock opened with a satisfying click. Inside was a large manila envelope, sealed and labeled in Clarence's handwriting. "To whoever finds this." Frank's hands shook as he broke the seal and pulled out the contents. The first item was a letter, dated 1 week before Clarence's disappearance in 2010. To the person reading this, it began. If you found my collection, then my plan has worked. I deliberately hid this building from my estate lawyers, manipulated the property records to ensure it would be overlooked, and eventually auctioned for next to nothing. I wanted these cars to go to someone who needed them, not to the state or to auction houses who would simply liquidate everything for maximum profit. Frank read on, his throat tight. I've spent the last years of my life alone, haunted by what I did and didn't do. I was complicit in a fraud that hurt people, and I was too much of a coward to speak up when it mattered. I let my partner threaten me into silence. I chose my own financial security over doing what was right. I've lived with that shame every day since. The letter continued. But there's more here than just metal and chrome. I've hidden something that matters more than all of this combined. Follow the numbers in my journal. They'll lead you to the truth, the complete truth about what Gregory Harding did, what I helped him do, and what happened to the contaminated land. That truth needs to come to light. I couldn't be the one to do it. I'm too much of a coward, too deeply implicated. But you, whoever you are, you have a chance to right an old wrong. The letter concluded, the cars are yours. Sell them. Keep them. Do as you wish. You've earned them by finding what I hid. But I'm asking you, as a final request from a man who failed, when it mattered, please don't let the truth die with me. Please be braver than I was. Frank read the letter twice, then a third time, trying to absorb what Clarence was asking of him. Walt stood beside him, reading over his shoulder, both men silent in the dim garage. He's asking you to expose this, Walt finally said, to take on whatever consequences come with it. Those kids, Frank said quietly. If that contamination is still there, if it was never cleaned up. I know. Walt put a hand on Frank's shoulder. But this isn't going to be simple. The Harding family, they're powerful. Gregory Harding might be dead, but his family is still prominent in this region. They have money, lawyers, political connections. Frank looked around at the cars, worth millions of dollars collectively. Life-changing money. Money that could solve every problem he had, pay his debts, secure his future, help his children. All he had to do was sell them quietly and walk away from Clarence's burden. But he thought of Margaret, of the values she'd lived by. She'd worked for years as a school nurse, devoted to protecting children. What would she have done in this situation? The answer was clear. She would have fought for those kids without hesitation, regardless of the personal cost. We need to verify the contamination first, Frank said, his voice steadier than he felt. If the land was cleaned up at some point, then this is just old history. But if it wasn't, then we have a responsibility, Walt finished. They spent the rest of the afternoon documenting everything. Walt used his phone to photograph all the documents, the journal entries, the pictures. Frank organized the papers chronologically, creating a timeline of events. The picture that emerged was damning. In 1978, Clarence Whitmore and Gregory Harding had formed a development partnership. They'd purchased the Riverside property cheaply because of its industrial past. An old textile factory had operated there until the 1960s, leaving behind contaminated soil. The contamination was known, documented in preliminary surveys. But Gregory had connections with the Planning Commission. He'd arranged for favorable officials to overlook the real environmental reports in exchange for cash payments. Clarence, according to his notes, hadn't known about the payoffs initially. He'd believed the clean reports Gregory showed him. When Clarence discovered the fraud in 1981, the project was already well underway. Investor money committed. Gregory had threatened him. If Clarence went public, They'd both face criminal charges. Clarence had helped prepare the initial documents, had signed off on submissions to the Planning Commission. His signature was on fraudulent paperwork. Terrified and ashamed, Clarence had stayed silent. The project had eventually collapsed anyway, when investors grew suspicious of the delays and cost overruns. The property had been sold to the county at a loss, Gregory and Clarence's partnership dissolving bitterly. Clarence had spent the next decades collecting cars, living reclusively, apparently watching and waiting. His later journal entries suggested he'd kept tabs on the riverside property. When the county developed it as an elementary school in 2005, his notes became anguished. "They built a school there," one entry read. "Children playing on poisoned ground. I did this. My silence allowed this. I'm a coward, and those children will pay for my cowardice." But he still hadn't come forward. Fear of prosecution, of public shame, had kept him quiet. Instead, he'd created this elaborate treasure hunt, hoping someone else would have the courage he lacked. Frank closed the journal, feeling the weight of Clarence's guilt and hope. The man had tried to atone in his own way, but it felt incomplete, unsatisfying. Still, Frank understood the paralysis of fear, the way shame could silence you. "We need expert help," Frank said. "Someone who knows about vintage cars, who can verify what we have and give us guidance." Walt nodded. "I know someone. Luther Briggs runs a restoration shop over in Harrisburg. He's honest. Been in the business 40 years. If anyone can tell us what these cars are worth and help us handle this properly, it's Luther." They locked up the garage carefully, Frank pocketing the key. As they drove back toward town in Walt's truck, Frank's mind churned with possibilities and fears. His life had been transformed in a matter of hours, from desperate poverty to potential wealth, from invisibility to holding explosive secrets. That evening, alone in his small rental house, Frank couldn't settle. He paced from room to room, Margaret's photograph drawing his eye repeatedly. He picked it up, studying her familiar face, the laugh lines around her eyes, the gentle smile. "What do I do?" he asked her image. "This could destroy me. They could take everything. But those kids—" His phone rang, startling him. The caller ID showed Annie's number. He almost didn't answer, not ready to explain anything yet. But guilt made him pick up. "Hi, sweetheart." "Dad." Her voice was strained, formal. "I just wanted to check in. It's been a few weeks." "I'm fine. How are the kids?" They went through the familiar, hollow dance of polite conversation. Annie talked about her children's activities, her husband's work promotion, the weather. Frank offered brief responses, distracted. "Dad, are you okay? You sound strange." He wanted to tell her everything, about the auction, the cars, the terrible discovery, but something held him back. Maybe pride, maybe protectiveness. "I'm fine, just tired." "Are you eating enough? You know you need to take care of yourself." The concern in her voice was genuine but distant, the worry of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than deep connection. It stung, though Frank knew he'd contributed to that distance with his own withdrawal after Margaret's death. "I'm eating fine. Don't worry about me." After they hung up, Frank felt more alone than before. His daughter was 3 states away, living a life he barely understood. His son was somewhere unknown, fighting battles Frank couldn't help with. The people who'd once been his world had drifted into orbit around him, close enough to see but too far to touch. Maybe that's why Clarence's letter had resonated so deeply. Here was another lonely man who'd lost his connections, who'd made mistakes and lived with regret, who desperately wanted his life to mean something in the end. Frank pulled out the leather journal and read more entries, getting to know Clarence through his words. The man had been thoughtful, observant, surprisingly poetic at times. His love for the cars was genuine. He saw them as art, as history, as monuments to human craftsmanship. But underneath the passion for automobiles ran a current of deep sadness. Clarence had been wealthy but friendless, successful but unfulfilled. His marriage to Margaret had been happy, according to his entries, but after her death in 1995, he'd retreated from the world. "I don't know how to be alone," one entry read. "Margaret was my translator, my bridge to other people. Without her, I'm just a strange old man with too much money and too many regrets. These cars are my only companions now. They don't judge. They don't ask questions I can't answer." Frank understood that loneliness intimately. The next morning, Walt arrived with Luther Briggs. The older man climbed out of Walt's truck with the careful movements of someone whose body had logged decades of hard work. He was 70, tall and lean, with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His handshake was firm, his expression cautiously curious. "Walt tells me you've found something interesting," Luther said, as they drove out to the property in convoy, Luther following in his own truck. "That's one way to put it," Frank replied. When they reached the clearing and Frank opened the garage door, Luther's reaction was worth the drive. The old mechanic stood frozen in the entrance, mouth slightly open, eyes wide. He walked slowly to the first car, the Shelby, and ran his hand along its fender with the reverence of someone touching something sacred. "My God," he breathed. "Is this real?" "It's real," Frank confirmed. "All of them are." For the next 2 hours, Luther examined each vehicle methodically. He checked VIN numbers against the titles, inspected engines and interiors, took notes in a small leather notebook he produced from his pocket. Frank and Walt watched in silence, letting the expert work. Finally, Luther set down his notebook and turned to face them. "Frank, do you understand what you have here? Valuable cars. This is one of the finest private collections of American muscle cars I've ever seen. Every vehicle is authentic, numbers matching, in remarkable condition. That Shelby GT500 alone is worth between $300,000 and $400,000. The Hemi, Cuda, depending on the auction, could bring $600,000 or more." Frank felt lightheaded. "And all of them together? Conservative estimate? $3.2 million. If we get the right buyers at the right auction, possibly 3.8. Luther paused. "Frank, where did these come from? Who owned this collection?" Frank explained about Clarence Whitmore, the auction, the deliberate hiding of the garage. He didn't mention the documents or the contamination. Not yet. Luther listened, nodding occasionally. "I knew Clarence slightly," Luther said when Frank finished. "He'd come into my shop sometimes, years ago, wanting to talk about restoration techniques or sourcing original parts. Strange man, brilliant with cars but deeply private. There were rumors he'd had some kind of scandal in his past, but no one knew details." He looked around the garage. "This explains a lot. He was building something here, preserving something." "Luther," Walt interjected, "can this be sold legally? The titles are all in Clarence's name." "The titles transfer with the property. Frank bought the property and everything in it at a legitimate auction. As long as the chain of ownership is clear, which it appears to be, he owns these cars free and clear." Luther smiled. "You're a wealthy man, Frank, or you will be, once we sell these properly." Wealthy. The word felt foreign, impossible. Frank DeLuca, who 3 days ago had been counting pennies for groceries, was now worth millions. It should have felt like pure joy, like salvation. Instead, it felt complicated, weighted with responsibility. "There's more," Frank said. "Something we need to show you." He brought out the documents, the photographs, Clarence's letter. Luther read everything carefully, his expression growing more serious with each page. When he finished, he removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "This is bigger than cars," he said quietly. "This is about corruption, environmental crime, children's safety." "Gregory Harding died 8 years ago," Walt added. "But his son, Preston Harding, is a state senator now, big in real estate development, just like his father." Luther's jaw tightened. "I know Preston Harding. He's got his fingers in everything. Development boards, planning commissions, fundraising for the governor. If his father was corrupt and he's built his career on that corrupt money, it gets worse," Frank said. "Look at these." He showed Luther the most recent documents, emails and memos Clarence had somehow obtained, dated from 2008 to 2010. They showed Preston Harding, then in his 30s and building his political career, communicating with lawyers about his father's old business dealings. One email in particular was damning. Preston had written to a family attorney, the Riverside property situation. "I understand father's original development partnership had complications. I need complete documentation of that project and the subsequent property transfer to the county. We cannot afford any exposure on this as I move forward with my campaign. Handle this discreetly." The attorney's response: "I've reviewed the files. The environmental issues from that era were never fully disclosed. The contamination paperwork appears to have been mishandled. I strongly advise against any action that would draw attention to this property." Preston's reply: "Then we do nothing and hope it stays buried. If anyone asks questions, we claim ignorance. The partnership dissolved 40 years ago. Father is gone. There's no trail back to us." "He knew," Frank said. "Maybe not about the original fraud, but he knew there was contamination that had been covered up, and he chose to protect his family's reputation instead of doing anything about it." Luther set down the papers, his face grim. "If this becomes public, Preston Harding's career is over. He'll fight like hell to keep this quiet." "Which is why Clarence was afraid," Walt said. "He mentions being watched in his later journal entries. Someone knew he had information." Frank thought about the photographs showing surveillance of Clarence's house, the paranoid tone of his final entries. "You think the Hardings knew Clarence had evidence?" "Suspected, maybe," Luther said. "Enough to keep tabs on him. When he disappeared, they probably assumed the problem had taken care of itself. Until now," Frank said. "Until I opened this garage." They stood in silence, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Frank's miraculous discovery had come with strings attached, dangerous strings that connected to powerful people who had much to lose. "What are you going to do?" Luther asked. Frank looked at the cars, then at Clarence's letter in his hand. He thought about his daughter's distant concern, his son's absence, his own invisibility in the world. He thought about Margaret and the values she'd lived by. He thought about 550 children attending school on poisoned ground. "I'm going to do what Clarence asked," Frank said. "I'm going to tell the truth." Walt nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this answer. Luther studied Frank for a long moment, then extended his hand. "Then you'll need help. I know people at the State Environmental Department, reporters who do real investigative work. If we're going to do this, we do it right. Document everything. Build an airtight case. Make it impossible to ignore or suppress." Frank shook Luther's hand, grateful. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Luther said. "This is going to get ugly. The Hardings will come after you with everything they have. You need to be ready for that." "I know." Frank touched the chain around his neck where Margaret's ring hung. "But some things are worth fighting for." Over the next 3 days, the three men worked systematically. Luther brought professional photography equipment and documented every car, every document, every piece of evidence. Walt organized the materials chronologically, creating a clear timeline that would be easy for authorities to follow. Frank read through Clarence's journal repeatedly, looking for additional clues or context. They discovered that the numbers circled throughout Clarence's journal corresponded to specific cars in the collection, their positions in the garage. Following this system, they searched each indicated vehicle for hidden compartments or additional evidence. Car number 3, a pristine 1965 Ford Mustang in deep blue, yielded the next discovery. Behind a false panel in the trunk, they found another metal box containing financial records, bank statements, wire transfer receipts, and ledgers in Clarence's meticulous handwriting. The documents painted a detailed picture of money flowing through the River Walk project. Initial investor deposits, totaling over $40 million, had been transferred into the development partnership's accounts. But then the trail became murky. Large withdrawals, often in increments just under the reporting thresholds, had been moved to various accounts. Clarence's annotations made the scheme clear. GH siphoned funds systematically, created dummy consulting companies, paid himself and his associates. Investors never knew where their money was really going. By the time the project collapsed, over $8 million was gone. The contamination was an excuse. Gregory wanted it to fail. He'd already extracted his profit. Frank felt sick reading it. Investors, probably ordinary people trying to secure their retirement or build wealth, had been systematically robbed by a man they'd trusted. But there was more. A letter, written from Gregory Harding to Clarence Whitmore, dated December 1981. The tone was casual, almost friendly, which made the content more chilling. Clarence, I understand you're having second thoughts about our arrangement. Let me be clear. We're in this together. Your signature is on every document, every filing, every report submitted to the Planning Commission. If I go down for fraud, you go down with me. Your wife, your reputation, your comfortable life, all of it disappears. Is that really what you want? Be smart, stay quiet. In a few years, this will all be forgotten, and we'll both move on with our lives. Don't make an enemy of me. You won't like the consequences. The threat was unmistakable. Clarence had been trapped, complicit enough to face prosecution, but not corrupt enough to be comfortable with silence. It must have eaten at him for decades. Walt discovered another document that made their situation more complicated. A draft letter from Clarence to the State Attorney General, dated 2009, but apparently never sent. In it, Clarence confessed everything: his role in the fraud, Gregory's scheme, the contaminated land, all of it. At the bottom, in different ink, Clarence had written, I wrote this 100 times. I never sent it. I'm a coward, but someone is watching my house. Black car, different plates each time, same 2 men. They know I have information. If I disappear, this letter is my testament. I was weak, but I tried at the end to be better. He knew they were after him, Luther said quietly. That's why he created this elaborate treasure hunt. He couldn't come forward himself, but he could set it up, so someone else would find everything after he was gone. Frank's phone rang, startling them all. He didn't recognize the number but answered anyway. Mr. DeLuca? A woman's voice, professional and efficient. This is Pauline Fletcher from the County Assessor's Office. I'm calling about a property you recently acquired at auction, 1847 Old Mill Road. Frank's heart rate kicked up. Yes. There seems to be a discrepancy in the property records. I need to schedule an appointment to come inspect the property and verify the contents. Would tomorrow afternoon work for you?" "What kind of discrepancy?" Frank asked carefully. "Just routine verification. The listing was rather vague. We need to ensure proper assessment for tax purposes." Something in her tone felt wrong, too smooth, too practiced. Frank made a quick decision. "Actually, I'm out of town for the next week. Can we schedule something when I return?" A pause. "Mr. DeLuca, this is time-sensitive. I could come by even if you're not present. I'd prefer to be there. I'll call your office when I return." He hung up before she could respond. Walt and Luther were staring at him. "That wasn't from the county," Frank said. "I don't know who that was, but something felt off." Luther pulled out his phone and called the county assessor's office. After a brief conversation, he hung up, his face grim. "There's no Pauline Fletcher working there, and they have no record of any inspection scheduled for your property." "Someone knows," Walt said. "Someone knows you found the garage." Frank's mind raced. The auction had been public, his name on the records. Anyone checking those records would see that Lot 47 had been sold. If the Hardings had been monitoring that property, or if they had someone in the county office feeding them information, they'd know someone had claimed it. "We need to move faster," Frank said. "Get the evidence to the right people before anyone can interfere." Luther nodded. "I'll contact my friend at the State Environmental Department. His name is Ken Yamamoto. We served in Vietnam together. He's honest, competent, and he doesn't owe the Hardings any favors." "What about the media?" Walt asked. "If this becomes public, it's harder to suppress." "I know a reporter," Luther said. "Judith Yang at the Capital Tribune. She's done investigative work on political corruption before. She'd be interested in this." They worked late into the evening, preparing multiple copies of everything. Luther took one set home for safekeeping. Walt secured another set in his safety deposit box at the bank. Frank kept the originals locked in the trunk of the Shelby. When they finally left the garage that night, Frank felt paranoid, checking the road behind them. Every car seemed suspicious, every shadow threatening. This was a new experience, having something valuable enough that people might want to take it from him. Back at his small house, Frank couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the fork in the road ahead. He could still back out. Sell the cars quietly, take the money, and let Clarence's secrets stay buried. No one would blame him. He was an old man who'd suffered enough. He deserved peace and security. But every time he considered it, he thought about those children at Riverside Elementary. What if the contamination was still active? What if kids were being exposed to lead or arsenic every day, suffering health effects that wouldn't show up for years? How could he live with himself, knowing he'd stayed silent to protect his own comfort? Morning brought unexpected news. Frank woke to his phone buzzing with a text from Walt. "Turn on Channel 7. Something's happening at Riverside Elementary." Frank fumbled for the television remote, his heart pounding. The local news showed aerial footage of Riverside Elementary School, emergency vehicles scattered across the parking lot. A reporter stood in front of the building, speaking urgently into a microphone. "Third child this week to be hospitalized with unexplained symptoms. Parents are demanding answers as to what's causing these illnesses. The school district has released a statement saying they're investigating, but many parents are keeping their children home until they get more information." Frank sat down heavily on his couch, the remote slipping from his fingers. It was happening. The contamination, if that's what this was making children sick right now, not in some theoretical future. His phone rang. "Luther." "Did you see the news?" "I'm watching it now," Frank said, his voice hollow. "This changes things. We can't wait for bureaucratic channels. Those kids need help immediately. What do we do? I'm calling Ken Yamamoto right now, and Judith Yang. This needs to come out today. Luther paused. Frank, once we do this, there's no taking it back. Are you ready? Frank thought about Margaret, about the values she'd taught their children, about the person he wanted to be. I'm ready. Within 2 hours they were meeting Ken Yamamoto at a coffee shop in Harrisburg, 40 minutes from Frank's town. Ken was in his early 70s, a compact man with grey hair and steady, intelligent eyes. He listened without interrupting as Luther explained the situation, and Frank presented the documents. Ken studied the environmental reports carefully, comparing the authentic contamination findings with the falsified clean reports that had been submitted to the Planning Commission. His expression grew darker as he read. This is criminal, he finally said. Not just fraud. This is endangerment. If this contamination was never remediated and children have been exposed. He looked at Frank. How certain are you that these documents are authentic? They came from Clarence Whitmore's personal files. Everything is documented, dated, cross-referenced. He kept meticulous records. Ken pulled out his phone. I'm calling the regional EPA office right now. They can have soil samples taken from the school within hours. If the contamination is active, we can get emergency orders to close the school and begin remediation immediately. As Ken made his calls, stepping outside for privacy, Luther texted Judith Yang, the reporter. She responded immediately, asking to meet that afternoon. Walt leaned close to Frank. You're doing the right thing. I hope so, Frank said. I keep thinking about what this will do to Clarence's reputation. He was complicit in this fraud, even if he was threatened into silence. He was complicit, Walt agreed, but he spent the rest of his life trying to make it right. He created this collection, this treasure hunt, specifically so the truth would come out. That's worth something, Ken returned, his face set with determination. The EPA is taking this seriously. They're mobilizing a team to collect soil samples this afternoon. With the hospitalizations in the news, they're treating it as an emergency. Results should be available within 48 hours. What about the documents implicating the Hardings? Frank asked. That goes to the State Attorney General's office. I know someone there, a prosecutor who specializes in corruption cases. She'll want to see everything you have. Ken looked at Frank seriously. Mr. DeLuca, I need to warn you. The Hardings are a powerful family with extensive connections. Once this becomes public, they'll come after you. They'll attack your credibility, dig into your background, make your life difficult. I understand. Do you? Because I've seen what happens when ordinary people go up against the wealthy and connected. It's not pretty. Ken's voice softened. I admire what you're doing, but make sure you're prepared for the consequences. Frank thought about his empty bank account, his strained relationships with his children, his anonymous existence. I don't have much left to lose, but those kids at that school, they have everything ahead of them. That afternoon, they met Judith Yang at a park halfway between Harrisburg and Frank's town. She was in her mid-40s, sharp-eyed and direct, carrying a weathered messenger bag full of notebooks and recording equipment. Frank told her the story from the beginning. The auction, the discovery of the cars, Clarence's hidden evidence, the contamination. Judith took notes rapidly, asking pointed questions, verifying dates and details. Can I record this? She asked, pulling out a small digital recorder. Frank hesitated, then nodded. Yes. For the next hour, he gave her the complete account, showing her copies of the key documents. Judith's questions were tough but fair, probing for holes in the story or inconsistencies in the evidence. She was particularly interested in the emails showing Preston Harding's knowledge of the contamination. "If I run this story," Judith said carefully, "Senator Harding will deny everything. He'll say these documents are fabricated or taken out of context. He'll accuse you of having ulterior motives, trying to shake down his family for money, maybe. Are you prepared for that?" "I'm not asking the Hardings for anything," Frank said. "I just want the truth out there." "The truth is going to destroy his career," Judith said. "Maybe his freedom, if prosecutors pursue charges. A man like that doesn't go down quietly." Frank met her eyes steadily. "Then I guess he shouldn't have covered up evidence that children were being poisoned." Judith smiled slightly. "I'm going to run this story. It'll be online tomorrow morning, in print the day after. Once it's out there, expect chaos." As they prepared to leave the park, Frank's phone rang. An unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Mr. DeLuca," a man's voice, smooth and professional. "My name is Jeffrey Crane. I'm an attorney representing the Harding family. I understand you've come into possession of certain property that once belonged to Clarence Whitmore." Frank's stomach dropped. He put the phone on speaker so the others could hear, and Walt quickly opened a recording app on his own phone. "I bought property at a legal auction," Frank said carefully. Of course. No one's questioning the legality of your purchase. But I'm calling to discuss some documents that may have been included with that property. Documents that contain certain, shall we say, allegations about my client's family." "I haven't made any allegations." "Not yet," Crane said, his tone sharpening slightly. "But I'm hearing rumors that you've been showing these documents to various people. Government officials. Reporters, perhaps. Is there a point to this call?" "The point, Mr. DeLuca, is that pursuing this matter would be unwise. These allegations involve events from decades ago concerning people who are now deceased. Dragging them up will only cause pain and serve no useful purpose." "Children are in the hospital," Frank said. "That seems pretty useful to me." Crane's voice hardened. "Those hospitalizations are unrelated to any supposed contamination from 40 years ago. You're not a scientist, Mr. DeLuca. You're not qualified to make those determinations." "That's why I contacted the EPA," Frank said. "Let them make the determination." "I see." A pause. "Mr. DeLuca, let me be frank with you. You're a man of limited means. Legal battles are expensive, very expensive. My client is prepared to pursue defamation claims, interference with business relationships, and any other cause of action our team can identify. You could lose everything, including those cars you've acquired." "Is that a threat?" "It's a reality check. You're playing in a league far above your experience. Walk away now. Sell your cars quietly and live your life. That's the smart choice." Frank felt his anger rising. "And if I don't? Then you'll discover that scrutiny works both ways. Your son Thomas, for instance. He has quite an interesting criminal history. Drug possession, probation violations. It would be unfortunate if certain authorities were encouraged to take a closer look at his recent activities." Frank's hand clenched around the phone. "Don't you dare bring my son into this." "No one's bringing anyone into anything, Mr. DeLuca. I'm simply pointing out that investigations have a way of expanding once they begin. You start looking into my client's family. Perhaps we start looking into yours. That's just how these things work." "We're done here," Frank said, his voice shaking with fury. "Think carefully before you do something you'll regret. My client is willing to be reasonable, but that window won't stay open forever." Crane hung up. Frank stood there, phone in hand, trembling with anger and fear. Walt put a hand on his shoulder. He's trying to intimidate you. That's all that was. He threatened Tommy. With what? Luther asked. Tommy's old charges. They're done, settled. They can't reopen them without cause. Judith was typing rapidly on her phone. That call was witness intimidation. You recorded it, right? Walt held up his phone. Every word. Good. Judith finished typing and looked up. I'm moving up my publication timeline. This story goes live tonight. Once it's public, any retaliation becomes obvious. Frank's phone buzzed with a text. His heart jumped when he saw it was from Tommy. Dad, can we talk? It's important. His son. The boy. Man now. He'd failed so many times. The addiction, the disappointment, the distance between them. And now the Hardings were threatening him. Frank stepped away from the group, hands shaking as he dialed Tommy's number. The phone rang 3 times before Tommy answered. Dad? Tommy, are you okay? I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. That's why I'm calling. Tommy's voice sounded different, clearer, stronger. Dad, I've been sober for 9 months. I've been going to meetings, working the program. I got a job at a restoration shop in Millville. I'm doing better. Frank felt tears spring to his eyes. Tommy, that's wonderful. I'm so proud of you. I wanted to tell you in person, but I kept putting it off. I was afraid you wouldn't believe me, that I'd let you down again. Tommy paused. Annie told me you bought some property at an auction. She thought maybe you'd gotten scammed or something. I wanted to check on you. Frank's throat tightened. His children, reaching out at the exact moment he needed them most. I didn't get scammed. It's complicated, but Tommy, where are you right now? I'm in Millville, about an hour from you. Why? Can you come here? To Harrisburg. I'm at Morrison Park and I need to see you. I need to explain some things. Dad, you're scaring me. What's going on? Please, son. Just come. I promise I'll explain everything. There was a long pause. Okay. I can be there in an hour. Frank returned to the group, wiping his eyes. My son is coming. He's been sober for 9 months. Walt smiled. That's good news, Frank. Real good news. The Hardings threatened him. They're going to dig into his past, try to use it against me. Then we make sure they can't, Judith said. My story will include the intimidation attempt. I'll paint a clear picture. Powerful family, trying to silence a whistleblower by threatening his recovering son. That's not a good look for a state senator. They waited in the park, Luther buying coffee from a nearby shop, Walt calling his wife to let her know he'd be late. Frank paced, watching the parking lot, his emotions a tangle of fear, anger, and hope. 53 minutes later, an old Honda pulled into the lot. Frank's breath caught as Tommy climbed out. His son looked different, healthier, his eyes clear, his movements purposeful, rather than the jittery uncertainty Frank remembered from their last encounter 2 years ago. Tommy walked toward them, and Frank met him halfway. They stood facing each other awkwardly for a moment, years of hurt and disappointment between them. Then Frank pulled his son into an embrace. I'm sorry, Frank said into Tommy's shoulder, for giving up on you, for not being there when you needed me. Dad, you never gave up, Tommy said, his own voice thick with emotion. I gave up on myself, but I'm back now. I'm really back. They separated, both wiping their eyes. Frank introduced Tommy to the others. Then they sat at a picnic table while Frank explained everything. The garage, the cars, Clarence's evidence, the contamination, the threats from the Hardings. Tommy listened intently, his expression growing more serious. When Frank finished, Tommy was quiet for a long moment. Dad, I need to tell you something. About the Hardings. Frank's stomach clenched. What about them? 3 years ago, when I was at my worst, I worked for them. It was just maintenance work, nothing important. But I was at Gregory Harding's old estate, the one they sold a few years back. They had me clearing out the basement before the new owners took possession. And there were these old file boxes. The estate manager told me to destroy them, throw them in the incinerator. Don't look at them, just burn them. I was high most of the time, so I did what I was told. Tommy pulled out his phone, scrolling through photos. But I kept one folder. I was thinking maybe I could sell documents to a collector or something. I wasn't thinking straight. Then I went to rehab and forgot about it. It's been in a box in my apartment this whole time. He showed Frank a photo on his phone, a manila folder, weathered and stained, with Riverside Confidential written across the tab in faded marker. Frank's heart hammered. Do you still have it? Yeah, it's in my apartment. I never opened it. Honestly forgot it existed until Annie mentioned you'd bought some property. Then I started thinking about those boxes, about the Hardings. Tommy looked at his father. This is connected, isn't it? It might be the missing piece, Luther said, leaning forward. The complete documentation of the cover-up. I can get it, Tommy said. I can drive home right now and bring it back. Wait. Judith held up a hand. If the Hardings know Frank is investigating, they might be watching his associates. Tommy, is your address on any legal documents connected to Frank? I don't think so. We haven't been in touch much until recently. Good. But be careful anyway. Get the folder. Don't tell anyone what you're doing, and come straight back. She wrote her number on a card. If anything feels wrong, anything, you call me immediately. Tommy nodded, standing. Frank stood with him, gripping his son's shoulders. Tommy, you don't have to do this. You're rebuilding your life. I don't want to put you at risk. Tommy met his father's eyes, and Frank saw determination there. Dad, for the first time in years, I can actually help with something. I can do something right. Let me do this. They embraced again, Frank fighting back tears. His son, his struggling, wounded son, was stepping up when it mattered most. After Tommy left, the group moved to a diner nearby, finding a corner booth where they could talk privately. Judith was already writing her story on her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Ken made more calls, coordinating with the EPA team at Riverside Elementary. They've collected samples from multiple locations around the school, Ken reported. Playground, sports field, near the foundations. They're prioritizing the analysis. Frank barely touched his coffee. He kept checking his phone, waiting for word from Tommy. The minutes crawled past. Finally, 90 minutes later, Tommy texted, "Got it. Heading back." Frank exhaled in relief. Walt squeezed his shoulder. "See? Everything's fine." But 40 minutes later, another text from Tommy made Frank's blood run cold. "Dad, there's a black car following me. Same one's been behind me for 20 miles. Frank's hands shook as he typed back. "Where are you?" Route 47, heading south toward Harrisburg. Judith looked up from her laptop. "Tell him to drive to the state police barracks on Route 47. It's about 10 miles south of Millville. If they're really following him, they won't follow him there." Frank relayed the message. Long minutes passed with no response. Frank stared at his phone, willing it to buzz. The others watched him, sensing his rising panic. Finally, at the barracks, car drove past when I turned in. "I'm okay." Frank's relief was so intense, he felt dizzy. "He's safe. He's at a police station." "Tell him to stay there," Judith said. "We'll come to him." They piled into Luther's truck, Luther driving with the practiced calm of someone who'd seen combat. The drive to the state police barracks took 30 minutes, Frank gripping the dashboard the entire time. Tommy's Honda was parked in the visitor lot. Frank practically ran inside, finding his son sitting in the lobby, a manila folder on his lap. Tommy stood when he saw Frank, and they embraced again. "I'm okay, Dad. Just spooked." A state trooper approached. "You folks okay? Your son said he thought he was being followed." Luther stepped forward smoothly. "We're involved in an environmental investigation. There's been some intimidation. We're being cautious." The trooper frowned. "You want to file a report?" "Not yet," Judith said. "But if you wouldn't mind, we'd like to look at these documents here, where it's safe." The trooper found them a conference room. They spread the contents of Tommy's folder across the table. Inside were dozens of pages, internal memos, financial records, and most damning of all, a handwritten letter from Gregory Harding to an associate. Luther read it aloud. "The Whitmore situation is contained for now, but the old fool is becoming unpredictable. He's threatened to go public multiple times. I've made clear what happens if he does, but I'm not sure fear will hold him much longer. We need to consider more permanent solutions if he becomes an active threat." The date on the letter was October 2010, 1 month before Clarence disappeared. The room fell silent. Frank felt sick. They killed him. The Hardings killed Clarence to keep him quiet. "We don't know that for certain," Ken said carefully. "But this letter, combined with Clarence's disappearance, that's something for law enforcement to investigate." Judith was photographing every page. "This is it. This is the story. Political dynasty built on fraud, corruption, possibly murder. The contamination is almost secondary." "The contamination is why we're here," Frank said sharply. "Those kids matter more than bringing down a politician." "You're right," Judith said. "But this is how we make sure the truth comes out and stays out. Preston Harding can't suppress this if it's about potential murder, not just environmental crimes from 40 years ago." Frank looked at his son, at Tommy's clear eyes and steady hands. His boy had come through when it mattered. After years of disappointment and heartbreak, Tommy had proven himself. "What now?" Frank asked. "Now we finish this," Ken said. "We turn everything over to the State Attorney General. We publish the story, and we let justice take its course." That evening, they gathered at Walt's house, the safest location they could think of. Walt's wife, Irene, made coffee and sandwiches, understanding without being told that something serious was happening. The dining room table became their war room, covered with documents, laptops, and phones. Judith sent her story to her editor at midnight. "It'll go live at 6 a.m., she said. "Once it's out, there's no putting this back in the bottle." Ken had spent hours on the phone with the state attorney general's office. A prosecutor named Helen Kowalski, no relation to Frank's landlord, was being briefed on the case. She wanted to see all the evidence first thing in the morning. Frank couldn't sleep. He sat on Walt's back porch, wrapped in a borrowed jacket against the cool night air, watching stars appear in the clear sky. Tommy joined him, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Can't sleep either?" Tommy asked, sitting beside his father. "Too much running through my head." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Finally, Tommy spoke. "Dad, I need to say something. About Mom." Frank's chest tightened. They hadn't really talked about Margaret since her death. Not honestly. Not about the pain. "I wasn't there when she needed me," Tommy continued, his voice rough. "I was too deep in my addiction, too wrapped up in my own problems. She died, and I wasn't there to say goodbye. That's something I have to live with." "She knew you loved her," Frank said. "She never stopped believing you'd find your way back." "Did you?" Stop believing, I mean. Frank considered lying, offering easy comfort. But Tommy deserved honesty. There were times I lost hope, times I thought I'd lost you forever. I'm sorry for that. Don't be. I gave you plenty of reason to give up. Tommy sipped his coffee. But I'm here now, and I want to be the son you and Mum deserved. Starting with this, helping you see this through. Frank put his arm around Tommy's shoulders, something he hadn't done in years. You already are, son. You already are. Inside, Judith's laptop chimed with an alert. She called out, "Stories live." They crowded around the screen. The headline read, "State Senator's family linked to decades-old fraud, environmental cover-up, possible homicide." Below it, Judith's byline and a photo of Riverside Elementary School. The story was comprehensive, carefully sourced, and devastating. Judith had included everything: the original fraud, the contaminated land, Gregory Harding's threatening letter, Preston Harding's emails showing his knowledge of the cover-up, and the suggestion that Clarence Whitmore's disappearance might not have been voluntary. She included my recording of Crane's call, Frank noticed. The part where he threatened Tommy. "Public record now," Judith said with satisfaction. "Let them try to intimidate you after that." Frank's phone began buzzing almost immediately. Unknown numbers, probably reporters. He silenced it. Annie's name appeared on the screen, and he answered that one. Dad, what's going on? I'm seeing your name in the news. Something about environmental fraud and vintage cars. Are you okay?" Frank stepped back onto the porch, explaining as simply as he could. Annie listened, occasionally gasping or interrupting with questions. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked when he finished. "Dad, I could have helped. I know, sweetheart, I'm sorry. I didn't want to worry you. I'm your daughter. Worrying about you is part of the job description." Her voice softened. "Are you safe? These people sound dangerous." "I'm safe. I'm at Walt's house with several friends. Tommy's here too." "Tommy?" Surprise in her voice. "How is he?" "Sober. Strong. He's been amazing through all this." Frank paused. "Annie, I should have reached out more. To both of you. After your mother died, I lost myself for a while." "We all did, Dad. But we're still family. We should have been there for each other." She hesitated. "I'm coming down. Don't argue. I'm already packing. I'll be there by noon tomorrow." "Annie, you don't need to." "Yes, I do. I'll see you tomorrow. I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart." By 3 a.m., the story had exploded across social media. Parents from Riverside Elementary were organizing protests, demanding immediate answers. The school district had announced an emergency closure pending EPA results. National news outlets were picking up the story. At 4 a.m., Preston Harding's office released a statement. Senator Harding categorically denies these baseless allegations. The accusations are politically motivated and rely on fabricated documents. The senator has full confidence that a thorough investigation will clear his name and expose this smear campaign for what it is. "They're going to fight," Luther observed. "Let them," Ken said. "The EPA results will speak for themselves." Dawn arrived with more news. The state attorney general was opening a formal investigation. The FBI was looking into potential obstruction of justice charges related to the threatening phone call. And the EPA had preliminary results from Riverside Elementary. Ken's phone rang. He answered, listened, his expression growing grave. He hung up and turned to face them. "The contamination is real. Lead levels at 3 times the acceptable threshold. Arsenic present in the soil near the playground. They're recommending immediate permanent closure and full remediation." The room fell silent. Frank felt vindication and horror in equal measure. He'd been right. Children had been in danger. But knowing it was real made it worse somehow, more concrete. Those hospitalizations, Judith said quietly. They were probably lead poisoning. The EPA is recommending health screenings for all current and former students, Ken added. This is going to be a massive public health response. Frank thought about Clarence, dying, or being killed, without ever seeing justice. But the truth was finally out. The children would be protected. The land would be cleaned up. The morning brought chaos. Frank's phone rang constantly with reporters requesting interviews. News vans appeared outside Walt's house, cameras pointed at the windows. Walt's wife, Irene, handled it with remarkable calm, closing the blinds and bringing out more coffee. Helen Kowalski, the state prosecutor, arrived at 9 a.m. with 2 assistants and a federal agent from the FBI. They commandeered Walt's dining room, spreading out all the evidence Frank had collected. For 3 hours they examined every document, asked detailed questions, and took official statements from everyone involved. Helen was in her 50s, grey-haired and sharp-eyed, with the bearing of someone who'd prosecuted serious criminals for decades. She studied Frank carefully as he recounted finding the garage. Mr. DeLuca, I need to be clear about something. If this goes to trial, you'll be a key witness. The defense will attack your credibility, dig into your personal life, try to paint you as someone with ulterior motives. Are you prepared for that? Frank thought about his empty bank account, his years of grief and unemployment, his strained relationships with his children. I don't have a perfect life, Miss Kowalski, but I'm telling the truth. I believe you, she said, and the evidence supports you. But court cases are unpredictable. Preston Harding has resources to mount a serious defense. Will there be criminal charges? Luther asked. Against Preston Harding? That depends on what we can prove he knew and when. The emails suggest he was aware of the contamination and chose not to report it. That's criminal negligence at minimum, possibly conspiracy to cover up environmental crimes. Helen paused. As for his father's death, Gregory Harding died of a heart attack in 2017. Natural causes, according to his death certificate. But Clarence Whitmore's disappearance is now being treated as a potential homicide. The FBI will be investigating. The federal agent, a woman named Karen Bryant, spoke up. The threatening letter Mr. Whitmore found, dated 1 month before his disappearance, establishes motive. We're reopening the case, looking at Gregory Harding's associates from that time period, anyone who might have acted on his behalf. Frank felt a chill. Clarence might have been murdered, and they were only now investigating it 15 years later. At noon, Annie arrived. She burst through Walt's door, searching for Frank with worried eyes. When she spotted him, she rushed over and hugged him tightly. "Dad, are you okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart." She pulled back, studying his face. "You look exhausted." "I haven't slept much." Annie turned and spotted Tommy sitting at the kitchen table. Brother and sister stared at each other for a long moment, years of distance and disappointment between them. Then Annie crossed to him. "Tommy, you look good." "I am good." Tommy stood, uncertain. "I'm sober." 9 months? Annie's eyes filled with tears, and she hugged her brother. "I'm proud of you." Watching his children embrace, Frank felt something loosen in his chest, a knot of grief and regret he'd been carrying since Margaret's death. His family was fractured, but maybe not broken beyond repair. The afternoon brought more developments. Preston Harding's lawyer, Jeffrey Crane, held a press conference attacking Judith's story as irresponsible journalism based on dubious documents. But his aggressive tone seemed defensive, and reporters pressed him with hard questions. "Mr. Crane, The EPA has confirmed dangerous contamination levels at Riverside Elementary. Does Senator Harding dispute those findings? The contamination, if it exists, has nothing to do with events from 40 years ago. The environmental reports from 1980 specifically identify the same contaminants now found at the school. How do you explain that? Crane's composure slipped. Senator Harding had no knowledge of any environmental issues, but the emails show he was specifically warned about contamination at that property in 2008. Are you saying those emails are fabricated? The press conference devolved into shouting. Crane ended it abruptly, retreating amid a storm of questions. By evening, public pressure was mounting. Parents from Riverside Elementary had organized a protest at the state capitol, demanding accountability. The governor's office released a statement promising a full investigation, and several of Preston Harding's political allies began quietly distancing themselves from him. Frank sat on Walt's porch again as the sun set, exhausted, but unable to rest. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Mr. DeLuca, this is Preston Harding. We need to talk, privately. Can we meet?" Frank showed the message to Helen Kowalski, who'd been about to leave. "Don't respond," she said immediately, "and definitely don't meet with him alone. What if he wants to confess? Make a deal. Then he can do it through proper channels, with lawyers present." Helen's expression was stern. "Mr. DeLuca, this man's family may have killed Clarence Whitmore. You're not meeting him alone under any circumstances." Frank nodded, though part of him was curious what Preston would say. Did he feel any remorse? Any guilt about the children who'd been poisoned by his family's greed? That night, Frank finally pulled out something he'd been carrying in his jacket pocket for weeks. A letter from Margaret, written in her final days. He'd been too afraid to read it, too afraid of the pain it would bring. But tonight, needing her guidance, he unfolded the worn paper. "My dearest Frank," it began in her shaky handwriting. "If you're reading this, I'm gone and you're struggling. I know you. You're thinking about all the ways you failed, all the things you should have done differently. Stop." Frank's vision blurred with tears. "You've always been the best man I've known. Strong not because you're hard, but because you care so deeply. That's your real strength. Whatever comes after I'm gone, remember this: you matter. Your life matters. The choices you make matter." Frank continued reading Margaret's letter through his tears. "Don't let fear make you small. I loved you because you always tried to do the right thing, even when it cost you. Keep being that man. Make me proud. Love always, Margaret." He folded the letter carefully, pressing it against his chest. She'd known him so well. Known exactly what he'd need to hear. Her words gave him strength for what was coming. The next morning brought the EPA's full report. The contamination at Riverside Elementary was extensive and dangerous. Lead levels exceeded safe thresholds by 300% in some areas. Arsenic, industrial solvents, and heavy metals permeated the soil. The school would need to be demolished, the land fully remediated, a process that would take years and cost millions. Helen Kowalski called with news. "We're filing criminal charges against Preston Harding. Conspiracy to conceal environmental hazards, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. The FBI is still building the case related to Clarence Whitmore's disappearance, but we have enough to move forward on the contamination cover-up." "When?" Frank asked. "This afternoon. There'll be a press conference at 2:00. I'd like you there if you're willing." Frank agreed. This was what Clarence had wanted. The truth exposed, justice served. At the State Attorney General's office, Frank stood with Tommy, Annie, Walt, and Luther, as Helen Kowalski addressed a packed room of reporters and cameras. Today we are announcing criminal charges against State Senator Preston Harding for his role in concealing environmental contamination at what is now Riverside Elementary School. Evidence shows Senator Harding was aware of dangerous contamination levels as early as 2008, but took deliberate steps to prevent disclosure, prioritizing his family's reputation over public safety. The room erupted with questions. Helen raised her hand for quiet. Additionally, the FBI has reopened the investigation into the disappearance of Clarence Whitmore in 2010. New evidence suggests Mr. Whitmore may have been the victim of foul play related to his knowledge of the contamination cover-up. More shouting questions. Helen pointed to a reporter. Is Senator Harding in custody? He surrendered to authorities this morning and has been released on bail. What about the children who've been exposed? Will there be compensation? That will be handled through civil proceedings. Our office is focused on the criminal case. After the press conference, Frank was surrounded by reporters, microphones thrust toward his face, cameras capturing his exhausted features. Mr. DeLuca, how does it feel to bring down a state senator? This isn't about bringing anyone down, Frank said quietly. It's about protecting children who couldn't protect themselves. What will you do with the vintage car collection? Frank hadn't thought much about the cars lately, consumed by the investigation. I'll sell most of them. Keep one to remember how this all started. Are you a hero, Mr. DeLuca? The question caught him off guard. No, I'm just someone who found something and did what needed to be done. The real hero is Clarence Whitmore. He set all this in motion, knowing it might cost him everything. And it probably did. That evening, Preston Harding appeared on television for a carefully staged interview. He looked haggard, his usual polish dimmed. I made mistakes, he admitted, his voice heavy. I knew there were questions about that property, and I should have pushed for answers. I was protecting my father's legacy, and that was wrong. Children were put at risk because of my silence. I have to live with that. It was a calculated confession, admitting enough to seem contrite without fully accepting responsibility. The interviewer pressed him. Did your father have Clarence Whitmore killed? Absolutely not. My father was a businessman, not a murderer. Mr. Whitmore's disappearance is a tragedy, but it had nothing to do with my family. Then where is he? Preston spread his hands helplessly. I wish I knew. I truly do. Frank turned off the television, disgusted. Preston was still playing political games, trying to salvage something from the wreckage. His phone rang. Luther. Frank, I've been contacted by 3 different auction houses. They all want to handle the sale of Clarence's collection. We could schedule something for next month. Get you top dollar. Okay, Frank said. But Luther, I want part of the proceeds to go to a scholarship fund for kids at Riverside Elementary to help with their education and any medical expenses from the contamination exposure. That's a good thing you're doing, Frank. Clarence would approve. After hanging up, Frank walked to his small kitchen and looked at Margaret's photograph. His life had been transformed, not just by money, but by purpose rediscovered, by family reconnecting, by standing for something that mattered. I did it, he told her picture. I did the right thing. I hope I made you proud. 3 days later, the FBI made an announcement that shocked everyone. Agents had interviewed Gregory Harding's former driver, a man named Carl Russo, who was now 78 and living in a nursing home. After seeing the news coverage, Russo had contacted authorities with information he'd kept secret for 15 years. In November 2010, He'd driven Gregory Harding to meet Clarence Whitmore at a remote location, an abandoned quarry 20 miles outside of town. Gregory had ordered Russo to wait in the car. Russo had heard raised voices, then a single gunshot. Gregory had returned alone 15 minutes later, visibly shaken, and told Russo that if he ever spoke of that night, his family would suffer. Terrified, Russo had stayed silent even after Gregory's death. But seeing the news about contaminated children, about Frank's courage in coming forward, had broken his silence. "I'm old," Russo told investigators in a recorded statement that was leaked to the press. "I'm dying. I can't take this secret to my grave knowing those kids are sick because we all stayed quiet. Mr. Whitmore tried to do the right thing, and Gregory Harding killed him for it." The revelation dominated every news cycle. The FBI launched a full investigation, searching the quarry, with ground-penetrating radar. Within 48 hours, they found human remains buried 15 feet below the surface. Dental records confirmed it was Clarence Whitmore. Frank watched the news coverage with Tommy and Annie, feeling a profound sadness. Clarence had been right to be afraid. His courage had cost him everything. "He died trying to protect those kids," Annie said softly. 15 years before they were even in danger. "He knew," Frank said. "He knew that contaminated land would eventually hurt someone. He tried to stop it, and they killed him for it." The discovery of Clarence's body changed everything. Preston Harding was arrested again, this time charged as an accessory after the fact to murder. Evidence showed he'd known about his father's crime. Emails and text messages recovered from his personal accounts revealed conversations about managing the Whitmore situation and ensuring the old man's confession stays buried with him. Preston's carefully crafted image of ignorance collapsed. His resignation from the Senate came within hours of his arrest. The trial moved quickly, driven by overwhelming public interest. Frank testified, describing how he'd found the garage, the evidence, Clarence's desperate plea for someone to finish what he'd started. On the witness stand, Frank held Clarence's leather journal. This man spent 15 years afraid, knowing terrible secrets, wanting to do the right thing but paralyzed by fear. When he finally found his courage, it killed him. But he made sure the truth wouldn't die with him. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Preston Harding was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to conceal environmental crimes, obstruction of justice, and accessory after the fact to murder. His sentence: 18 years in federal prison. Carl Russo, Gregory Harding's driver, received immunity for his testimony. He died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks after the trial ended. The weight of his secret finally lifted. For Frank, the end of the trial brought a strange emptiness. The mission was complete. Justice had been served, but Clarence was still dead, and 15 years of his life had been stolen by greed and violence. The car auction happened in early spring. Luther had arranged everything, attracting serious collectors from across the country. One by one, Clarence's carefully preserved vehicles rolled across the auction block. The 1970 Plymouth Hemi Cuda sold for $675,000. The 1963 Corvette Stingray brought $420,000. Each sale brought gasps from the crowd. When the 1967 Shelby GT500, the first car Frank had uncovered, came up for auction, Frank made a decision. He placed a bid himself, buying it back for $380,000. Tommy looked at him in surprise. "Dad, why?" "Because this is where it all started," Frank said simply. "This car changed my life. It deserves to stay." When the final gavel fell, Frank's portion of the proceeds totaled just over $3 million after auction fees and taxes. It was more money than he'd earned in his entire working life. Standing in the now empty garage where he'd first made his discovery, Frank felt Clarence's presence. The cars were gone, scattered to new owners who would cherish them. But the space still held echoes of the lonely man who'd built this collection, who'd tried to atone for his mistakes, who'd trusted a stranger to finish his work. "I kept my promise," Frank said to the empty air. "Rest easy, Clarence. The truth is out. The children are safe. You can rest now." 6 months later, Frank stood in his new garage, watching Tommy work on the Shelby GT500. The car gleamed under the lights, its deep blue paint perfect, chrome sparkling. Tommy had become skilled at restoration work, his job at Luther's shop turning into a genuine career. "Hand me that socket wrench," Tommy said, his voice muffled from under the hood. Frank passed it to him, content to simply be present. These quiet hours working together had become their ritual, a way of rebuilding what addiction and grief had torn apart. "How's the engine running?" Frank asked. "Like a dream. This car is a masterpiece." Tommy emerged, wiping his hands on a rag. "Dad, I've been thinking. Next month is my 1-year sobriety anniversary. I want to do something to mark it. What did you have in mind?" "I want to take the Shelby to a car show. Show people what we've done with it. What you've done with everything." Tommy's expression turned serious. "You changed a lot of lives, Dad. Not just mine. Those kids at the school, Clarence's memory, even Preston Harding in a weird way. You gave him a chance to face what his family did." Frank shook his head. "I just did what needed doing. That's what makes it matter." The house Frank had bought was modest. 3 bedrooms, a proper garage, on a quiet street with good neighbors. He'd paid off all his debts, established the Clarence Whitmore Memorial Scholarship Fund with $500,000, and invested the rest conservatively. He wasn't wealthy by millionaire standards, but he was secure, comfortable, free from the desperate poverty that had defined his last years. Annie visited every month now, bringing his grandchildren. They played in the yard while Annie and Frank talked on the porch, rebuilding their relationship conversation by conversation. She'd apologized for her distance after Margaret's death, and Frank had apologized for shutting her out. Forgiveness came slowly, earned through consistent presence. Walt still came by most days, and they still played chess. Walt usually won, but Frank was getting better. Luther had become a close friend, stopping by the garage to consult on restoration projects, or just to share coffee and stories. The Riverside Elementary situation had resolved as well as could be expected. The school had been demolished, the land undergoing extensive remediation. A new school was being built 2 miles away on clean land, with state-of-the-art facilities funded partially by the settlement from the Harding family estate. Children exposed to the contamination were receiving medical monitoring and treatment, all expenses covered. Parents had sent Frank letters, dozens of them, thanking him for his courage. Some included pictures of their children, healthy and thriving now that the danger was removed. Frank kept those letters in a box, reading them when doubt crept in about whether the turmoil had been worth it. One afternoon, Frank received a visitor. A woman in her 60s, well-dressed and nervous, knocked on his door. "Mr. DeLuca, my name is Patricia Whitmore Chen. I'm Clarence Whitmore's niece." Frank invited her in, offering coffee. Patricia explained that she'd been estranged from her uncle for years, barely knowing him. But seeing the news coverage, learning about his collection and his courage, had made her want to understand him better. "I always thought Uncle Clarence was just a strange, reclusive man," she said. "I didn't know he'd been carrying this burden, trying to protect people even after death." Frank showed her photos of the car collection, shared some of Clarence's journal entries that weren't evidence in the trial. Patricia cried, reading her uncle's words about loneliness and regret. "He wasn't a bad man," Frank said. "He made mistakes, got caught up in something terrible, but he spent the rest of his life trying to make it right." "Thank you," Patricia said, "for honoring his wishes, for seeing past his flaws to the good he was trying to do." After she left, Frank sat in his living room, Margaret's photograph on the mantel. The pocket watch Clarence had left in the final car, engraved with "Truth above all," sat beside it. Frank wore it sometimes, feeling its weight, remembering the journey it represented. His phone buzzed, a text from Annie. "Kids want to know if Grandpa can teach them about cars this weekend." Frank smiled, typing back, "Absolutely. Bring them Saturday morning." That evening, as the sun set, Frank walked out to the garage. The Shelby sat waiting, beautiful and powerful, a monument to second chances. He ran his hand along its fender, remembering that first moment when he'd pulled back the tarp and discovered treasure beyond imagination. But the real treasure hadn't been the cars or the money. It had been finding purpose again, reconnecting with his children, standing for something that mattered. It had been learning that at 61, with nothing left to lose, he still had something valuable to give. Frank thought about Clarence often, about the lonely man who'd built this elaborate treasure hunt, hoping someone worthy would find it. Someone who needed hope as desperately as Clarence had needed redemption. "We did it," Frank said quietly to Clarence's memory. "Your collection saved me, and together we saved those kids. That's a legacy worth leaving." He locked up the garage and walked back to his house, where light glowed warm in the windows. Inside, Tommy was making dinner, music playing softly. A simple evening in a simple house, but it was home. It was family. It was enough. Frank had learned that life could change in an instant, for worse, as it had when Margaret died and he lost everything, or for better, as it had when he took a chance on a mysterious property at a county auction. The key was staying open to possibility, having the courage to act when opportunity appeared, and choosing to do the right thing, even when it was hard. At 61 years old, Frank DeLuca had discovered he still mattered. His choices still had weight. His life still had purpose. And sometimes, when you've lost everything and have nothing left to lose, that's exactly when you find the courage to risk everything for what's right. He touched the pocket watch in his pocket, feeling its steady tick against his palm. Truth above all. It was a good principle to live by, a good legacy to leave behind. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys. But tonight, Frank was at peace, surrounded by family, grounded in purpose, grateful for second chances and the mysterious ways they sometimes arrive. The story of a desperate man buying an abandoned garage for his last $100 had become something more. A story about redemption, courage, justice, and the enduring power of doing the right thing. It was a story worth telling, worth living, worth passing on. And in a way, it was just beginning.